Have you noticed there's a few different kinds of like foods that like one day they're good and the next day they're bad? Yeah. One day the science says, oh yeah, you could eat as much of this as you want, and the next day they're like, oh, you've got to watch out for that. I've discovered that knowing whether salt is good or bad for you is quite the challenge. And I've noticed that some people, I won't mention any names, but you might see one or two at Denny's tonight if you should happen to come, put salt on everything. Other people just a little bit here and there. And so I'm always curious as to how it is that they have decided that this is the exact amount when some of us don't do it a lot. Some people just put salt all over. And by the way, I found out in my little research that 75% of the sodium that you get is already in your foods. So if you're pouring it on, I don't know if that means you're getting 75% more. Anyway, salt, though, is essential for life, and it controls the balance of fluid in your body. Here's the way I understand the science. If I'm wrong, don't correct me. You can just say, hey, he's wrong, and keep it to yourself and all of that. But my understanding is that if you get a little too much salt, what happens is it gets into your bloodstream, and it pulls all the fluid out of your surrounding body parts and puts it into the bloodstream, which then increases your blood pressure. See, I told you I'd be right. According to the the American Heart Association, it is only excess salt that causes a problem. It's only when you have too much in your bloodstream that you really have an issue. And the more salt, the more fluid in the bloodstream, and the more your blood pressure goes up, the harder it is for it to pump, and the harder it is for it to pump, the more tired your heart gets. At least that's what I understood their website to say. So they tell you you've got to stay away from the salty 6. Now, I will tell you in the outset here, what I'm trying to do is get your mind off of lunch. By telling you these foods, which is everything that you like, are on the bad list. And you'll not be hungry after that, and I can preach all afternoon. Cold cuts and cured meat? No, no, no. Too much salt in those things. No more cold cuts or cured meat. Pizza has way too much salt in it. I didn't make the list. That was the American Heart Association. So don't shoot the messenger, all right? Soup is too salty. I'm just telling you. I'm not making this up. Breads and rolls, of course, we knew that already. See, now you're not hungry anymore. Chicken is too salty. It's on the salty 6 list. I don't know. You need to take it up with the American Heart Association. That's not me. It's the American Heart Association says you need to watch out for chicken. It's really salty. And finally, burritos and tacos. I'm sorry. But now that you're not hungry, we can move on. Light controls our health in unexpected ways. We don't think too much about how light affects us until every so often we may find ourselves being a little bit, maybe, depressed because here in Yuma it is so cloudy all the time. They say that you can have these adverse effects from insufficient light exposure. And what they mean is not like the lights that are in front of me or the fluorescent lights that are in the ceiling that are just so wonderful, but actual sunlight. You need it. And so according to everydayhealth.com, not only can we have emotional struggles like depression and so forth, we can actually have a physical reaction to a lack of light, to a lack of natural sunlight. That's interesting. So they say there's some things that you need to do in order to make sure this is good. The first one is you need to take a walk every morning to start your day. They say that people who are dog walkers tend to be healthier than those who are not dog walkers. And of course, the entire reason is that they start their day off with sunlight. You're not buying it. I'm just telling you, this is what they say. It's what they tell you. They say that you should spend at least 15 to 20 minutes early in the day, if you're not a dog walker, sitting next to a window where there's lots of sunlight coming in. It'll also help warm you up this time of year. Just open up that mini blind and you just let that sunlight in and you just sit there and bask in the nice warm rays, and it'll be awesome. So clearly, salt and light are important to us as human beings. We probably knew that coming in here, but hey, I got to teach you sometimes things that you didn't already know. And I could tell when I got through the list of salty six, you didn't know it. And some of you don't know that you need to go buy a dog so you'll be healthier. Now I have continued that. So today we're going to continue our series in the Sermon on the Mount with Jesus' teaching on salt and light as a metaphor for who we are supposed to be.
Amen. Yeah.
Some of you are excited and sitting on the edge of your seats. The rest of you, sit on the edge of your seats and be excited. There you go. You're coming along with me. The Sermon on the Mount, just as a reminder, follows Jesus' many healings. Matthew tells us about Jesus healing all the people of all the diseases, so much so that people were coming to him, and there were big, big crowds, right? Right? And so Matthew presents Jesus as sort of having the authority of Moses. And so he is sort of presenting, okay, Jesus goes up on the mountain, which suggests this sort of divine revelation. This word from God is about to take place. And then he has him sit down in order to talk to people, which puts him in that sort of official teaching position. And in fact, at that time, the Jewish people would call it the seat of Moses. And that was the seat of authority. That was the place to be. All right? That was who you were going to listen to. Now, pop quiz. I told you last week there was going to be a test. What does Matthew intend for us to read in the sermon?
You're going to tell us. So far, nobody's going to. 3 hours.
I have crickets.
All right, you guys are going to get some homework. It's a summary of Jesus' essential teachings. It's the morals. It's the kingdom. What does the kingdom look like? It's about salvation. How does one enter the kingdom and be saved? And by the way, we'll be touching on prayer in this series. All right? Go ahead, write that all down. There'll be a test next week. I want you to be ready. I warned you last week and you didn't listen. My question for us is, as we continue in the Sermon on the Mount, and we start talking about salt and light, what must we consider about these metaphors? You see, the thing that I've noticed about the Sermon on the Mount as we got started last week with the Beatitudes is that so often we look at these things as to-do lists. And when it comes to salt and light, I'm a little skeptical that it would be a to-do list. So what is it that Jesus wants us to consider if he were up on the mountainside and we were there waiting as he sits to hear his teaching? Why is he saying this? What does he want us to leave? I guess the question is he calling us to do something very specific? Is there a certain task that these things are about? Our text this morning is Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16, which say this: "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Now, I know some of you say, listen, I've heard that since I was a kid in Sunday school, and that was a couple of years ago. Right? Hey, I know, but I'm wondering, did you ever really catch this one important fact about what we just read? Did you ever catch that Jesus does not ever explain his salt metaphor? He simply says, "You, my disciples, are the salt of the earth." If salt loses its saltiness, which, by the way, is an inconceivable thing.
That's right.
If salt loses its saltiness, it's no good anymore, except to be trampled underfoot. Now, if I were to take this out of context, and if you had never heard it before, and I were to tell you that, you would sit there and you would give me that look you did when I told you that burritos and tacos were on the salty 6 list, or that pizza was on there. That sort of confused, what? Look. He doesn't really explain it. I don't know. He's just not specific as to exactly what the disciples are to represent. You're the salt of the world. Now, there are some things that, of course, we're going to talk about, some of these things that he's assuming that we're thinking. But if I were to walk up to the random stranger who'd never been in the Bible before and say, "Hey, you're the salt of the earth," they'd look at me like I was crazy. They might be right.
Amen.
So we know what salt does. First off, it's a seasoning, right? Yep. Most of us, when we reach for the salt shaker, aren't thinking, I need to preserve this food. We're thinking, I'm going to eat it. It doesn't need to be preserved. It needs to be eaten, right?
Yep.
So seasoning is one of those things, and I started to think about this. Do Christians season the world? And if we do, are we doing it in the right way? It's kind of a scary thought. Kind of a certain thing. I get that back in Jesus' time, salt was a seasoning just like it was today. I understand that part of this whole metaphor that Jesus is getting comes from when they would get the salt from the Dead Sea, and part of the problem is there's gypsum, I guess, within the salt, and so you would end up sometimes getting some salt that really isn't salty. It's actually more gypsum-y. Which wouldn't taste very good on your eggs. All right? When I think of the question, how did Jesus' disciples season the world? My problem is that when I look around, I see some things that maybe aren't so seasoning. That maybe aren't the seasoning or the taste that I think we would want, or the flavor that Christ would want us to be. Right?
Yep.
Nobody in this room, of course. I'm talking about, out in the real world. We got lots of flavor in this room. thought it was really interesting. The Urban Dictionary says salty means either upset or mad. So one of our teenagers might say, a bunch of salty Christians, and what they really mean is we're a bunch of upset or angry Christians. Probably not that far off for some churches and some people.
True.
I don't know if that's the kind of seasoning that Jesus is looking for here. And so as I've thought about this, I've thought, okay, well, if Jesus wants us to season the world, why didn't he be a little more specific? You're the salt of the world, and here is how you get that perfect seasoning. If the blood needs this exact amount of salt, this is how you can exactly season the world. Right? But Jesus doesn't say that. He doesn't really explain it. He just says that crazy thing. You're the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its saltiness, it's no good anymore, just good to be trampled underfoot. Whatever that means. Hope I'm making you think now. Some of you I am. Some of you are like, oh my goodness, how long is he going to talk about this? How can we flavor the world? That's been the question that as I've been preparing, how could we flavor the world? And I've got some answers for that, but we're going to come back to that. The next thing is that salt back then had a very purifying effect. Purifying or cleansing or healing, those are kind of all in the same sort of vein. So they say that if you got a cut back then, that if you didn't clean your cut out with some salt, then you could end up with gangrene or whatever else. Today, if you pour salt in your cut, you're going to be very pained, but your wound will be very cleaned, because they say what happens is you put the salt in and all the bad things, the germs and everything else, stick to the salt, you wash it out, and now you have just purity in your cut. Painful? Wouldn't recommend it. But that's what they say. So there's no other cleaning agents, so salt is it. As I was looking through ways to use salt, somebody said you could use it to get rust off of a car. That you could use it to get stains out of your sink. Don't know if you've ever tried it, but if you try it and it works, there you go. No extra charge. So in a sense, cleansing and healing are the same things. Do you see the connection I'm trying to make for you in our Christian life? Cleansing and healing. And by the way, some of that cleansing and healing happens within us, and sometimes we help God as He facilitates that cleansing and healing in others. So I kind of can get that. So if we're to be agents of purification and healing, what are we to do? Because something that I've noticed is that if you walk up to a random stranger on the street and say, hey, you look really like you are of this world, dirty, going to hell, I want to help you get clean. That they will walk the other way. Probably 10 out of 10 times. And the other one, they're too high to know the difference. What are we supposed to do if we're going to be cleansing, healing agents in a world that so desperately needs cleansing, purifying agents? It's a hard question. It's a hard thing. And I think sometimes we just jump to a quick conclusion and say, this is what it is, when it's not that easy. I think one of our problems with this passage is that every time we hear it said, or we see it in a meme, or somebody brings it up, we go, oh yeah, I got that. Right? It's easy. It's easy. Salt and light. Yeah. Some of you aren't really with it. Preserving. The three major things that biblical scholars agree are sort of this seasoning, this purifying or cleansing or healing, and then this idea of preserving, because back in the times before we had refrigerators, you had to have something to preserve, and the only thing they had at that time was good old salt. I don't know how they got around the health effects of the salty six. But preserving. What exactly is preserved by Christian actions? Have you really thought about that question? If we go into the world and behave as we should behave because we are followers of Christ, how does that act as a preservative in our world? I could see seasoning. The people get to see what life with God is like. We have examples in our own church of troublemakers. But they are Christian women. They love me.
Absolutely.
For sure.
But what exactly is preserved? By the way, how do we as Christ followers go about preserving? I'm a bit fearful that sometimes when we approach this, the thing we approach is politics. We got to preserve our rights, or Jesus might somehow fade away to the back. If that's your idea of preserving, you need a life preserver, because this is not it. Okay? There's a lot of other uses for salt. Again, you can go to websites, the 101 ways to use salt that you'd never thought of before. You can try any of them on that website if you want, or whatever else. But those were the 3 that were so big back before you had the internet and you could share information so easily. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how some people figured out how to do some of the stuff they do with salt. When I think of all of the ways that I saw that were ways that you could use salt in today's world, I couldn't find a single one that would line up with it. This is what you need to do. If you are a Christ follower and you are going to be the salt and light of the world, this is the one thing, just this little thing, it's all you got to do. No task list, not at all. Now, as we move on to light, Jesus does expand his light metaphor. Thankfully, he gives us a very brief explanation of what he means. And by the way, it's very brief. You are the light of the world. City on a hill can't be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a bushel. Therefore, go and do good deeds.
Amen.
Finally, something we can do so that other people will see it. And God will be glorified. Good stuff, good stuff. You are the light of the world. Let your light shine before others. We can do this.
Amen.
This part is easy. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, we can keep ourselves busy doing this. Forget that whole salt thing. I think the reason Jesus didn't expand on it is because he was about to say this one, it's better. Because we know what to do here.
Yep. Sure.
Some of you are like, oh, did he really just say that? I was kidding. Some things we know about light. God is called light. Light is a very important metaphor in the Bible. So, God is light, which would make us children of the light, right? It's good stuff. In Isaiah 51, Israel is to be a light to the nations. See how easy this one is? It's all throughout the Bible. It makes it super easy. All we have to do is be super Christians so other people will see it and they'll give the credit to God and they will flock to us to find out exactly just like they did with Jesus.
Not necessarily.
You're not buying that. I can tell. Too much work for you? Be a super Christian? Always do everything perfect? Isn't that kind of what you get out of that, though? That we got to somehow do it. You know, the city on the hill is typically thought of as a reference to Jerusalem. So when Jesus is saying, look, this town or this city on the hill, it cannot be hidden, what he's basically saying is that God's activity in the world can never be hidden. And you are part of it. Some of you are not excited about that at all. Look, I'm sorry about the salty 6. I just gave you a public service announcement. Go have your pizza after church. It's okay. Now let's try this again. City on a hill can't be hidden because it's God's activity, and you are part of that activity. Oh. I thought I was going to have to do it a third time. Some things to remember is that the world is a very dark place. You don't need to look very far to find evidence of that. Yeah, you may have a neighbor who's generally a very good person, but we also have neighbors that are not. I kind of sometimes really enjoy living in Yuma because I can sort of be insulated from some of the craziness that goes on. You know, you turn on the TV here, and if somebody was killed last night in a murder, it's a very, very unusual event. When I lived in Chandler, Maricopa, you turn on the TV, and there were too many for them to even talk about. Sometimes when you watch the local news here, they kind of pretend like we're an island in of themselves. They might give you a few minutes of the national stuff, but for the most part, it's got to be really important. So you have to turn to and go looking for some of the news about what the crazy people in Washington are doing, for example. It's not as evident in our wonderful community. When you step back and you realize that we are becoming a less and less civilized society, you began to realize that this world is indeed a very dark place. So who are we? We're the light. And I got to tell you this, the light will be noticed.
Amen.
You don't sound too convinced, but I'm going to tell you, the light will be noticed. If you need proof of this, I invite you to do the following. I don't normally invite you to the movies, but you can go down to the movies. Wait until the movie starts and it gets to a really good part. Whip out your phone and start playing. You will be noticed. Some of you laugh, an uncomfortable laugh like you've done this. Some of you are like, I know, I almost killed that person last time I went to the movies. Light is something that is noticed. It cannot be hidden. Have you ever tried to get all of the light out of a room? I remember when I was a kid and you wanted to see if something glowed in the dark. And so you would have to find a bathroom because it's usually in the center of the house. And you almost think maybe it's glowing a little bit, but you can't really tell because there's a little sliver of light coming in at the bottom of the door. So you take the towel you're not supposed to take off the rack and you put it in front. Am I the only one that's ever done that? I remember one time when Carissa and I went and we toured I forget exact names, but the Queen Mine in Bisbee, Arizona. If you've ever done that, they put you on a little train and they take you like a mile into the mine, and then they have you go up in this little thing where a miner might have been, and you all have these like hard hats with a light on it, and they say, you know, the miners would work with just one candle. You'd think, one candle? How do you work with just one candle? And he'd say, let me show you. And he'd light the one candle. He'd say, now everybody turn off your lamps. And everybody turned off their lamps. And one candle provided an amazing amount of light inside the mountain. And then he'd say, if you want to know exactly how dark it is, please don't be frightened as I blow out the candle. It was dark. We had noticed the light even from one candle. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Amen.
See what I'm getting at? Light is also for helping. That's why when you light the light, you put it way up high so everybody can see. You don't go ahead and say, all right, we need some light. Here, somebody hand me that bushel. Right? Light's a good thing. And by the way, sunlight's really good. So good that they tell you you need 15 to 20 minutes in the morning. You should walk your dog. And if you don't have one, go buy one. I guess you could borrow one. Whoa. Jesus gets so specific. He says, Christians are the light through works that glorify God.
Amen.
I want to kind of mess you up here just a minute. Because I want to tell you an inevitable and uncomfortable truth. Are you ready? There's something I've learned. I'm a whole 44 years old. I know I'm old. But I've noticed that time after time after time after time after time, that if you go and intentionally do a work with the hopes that anyone will notice what you are doing for God, it almost always fails. Oh, we're going to do something great for God. Oh, wait, you'll see. It's those works that we didn't even think about that people go, something different about that person. Whoa, what do we do with that? And Jesus is so clear about the good deeds and the glorification of the Father. And I know part of what he's trying to do there is say, look, do good deeds that God will be glorified, because otherwise we'll stop and we'll try to think, okay, what can I do that's going to make a difference in this world and people will notice me?
Yeah.
We all want to be significant whether we like it or not. This kind of goes back to what we talked about last week with the Beatitudes and hey, we should be humble people, right? And the best way to be humble is to stand up and go, hey, everybody, look how humble this guy is. Right? Hey, I want to point to God. And the way I'm going to do that is, look, hey, everybody, look. Hey, did you see? I'm feeding the poor. I don't know what to do with that. I thought about this. Is it about feeding the poor? Is Jesus saying, look, if you would feed the poor, because that's a work that we could all do. Is it about feeding the poor? And I'm just convinced that I'm not sure it is. Yes, we are called to feed the poor, but I don't think that that's what Jesus is talking about if we're going to be the light to the world. In case you didn't know, the government does this too. Who gets glorified when the government does it? It's about caring for widows. Look, I know the government does a really good job at these things, right? Does way better than the church could ever do. Not. Anybody in the world can feed the poor, care for a widow, clothe the naked. Is it about showing kindness to the foreigner? I've heard this one a lot recently. If we're going to be the light of the world, we got to show kindness to the foreigner. Yes. But I think if we only are trying to show kindness to the foreigner so that God will be glorified, we will have missed the point.
True.
Now let me confuse this a little bit, and I thought you would only want one sermon this morning, so I'm only going to give you one. You're going to have to come back when we get to chapter 6 for the other half. But the start of chapter 6 will tell us to keep our good deeds to ourselves. Wait. Jesus is not schizophrenic. He is not saying over here, do your good deeds so that others will see them and God will be glorified, and then coming over here and going, hey, keep these things hidden. We'll come back to that. Just wanted to throw that in there to confuse you some more. Because I'm convinced that what happens is we begin to struggle to put being light into practice. I don't think there's anyone who follows Christ who would say, I don't want to be the light to the world. I don't want to be the salt of the world. Anybody in here going, yeah, I'm a Christ follower. Would rather not do that. See no hands. How do we put this into practice? If the challenge is the tasks involved, I'm convinced that we may have the wrong approach. Do you follow what I'm saying here? You see, the problem that we run into is we're people. We're fallen people. We're sinful people. And so when we read things like, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the earth, we go, okay, what's the minimum? If you're really competitive, you say, what is everybody else doing so I can do just a little more? Right? Jesus says, yep, I'm not going to tell you. Check it out. I'm going to make you figure it out on your own. Jesus with an evil, maniacal laugh, right? You figure this one out. No. The problem is we look at it as a task. It's sort of like in the Beatitudes. Well, how can we be more meek? Because that's what we're supposed to be doing. We look at the Beatitudes and we see all these things, and if we take them as a task list, we'll miss it. And I'm convinced that when it comes to salt and light, we could be in the exact same boat. These are not to-dos, they're a to-be.
Amen.
Not a to-do, but a to-be. So I ask the question, is this nearly a continuation of the Beatitudes theme? Let me give you my answer. Yeah. It's what we're supposed to be, not what we're supposed to do. It's what we're supposed to be, not what we can do. You see, we have already been declared to be salt and light. Are you buying this? Some of you, yes. Some of you, not so much. Jesus never says, you are going to be someday the salt and light of the world. What does he say? You are. Jesus never says, well, maybe if you're good enough, maybe if you can reach a certain level, you then might be salt and light to the world. Never says that. He says, you are. You're catching on. Jesus already says it's done. It's a done deal. This is over with. You don't even have to think about it anymore. Because guess what? It's what you are. That kind of makes a little more sense about the salt thing, right? It's not about what I have to do. It's about who I am. Yeah. And if I'm not doing what Christ has called me to do, guess what? I'm worthless. Just like salt and light are essential for our bodies and our survival, they are essential in the world. No question about it, no ifs, ands, or buts. We have to do what God has called us to do. He has declared us to be the salt. He has declared us to be the light. They are essential for the world around us. And what we have to consider about the metaphors of salt and light isn't that difficult. Well, maybe it is. Nah. Yeah. Nah. Well, maybe a little. You see, what are salt and light? Salt and light are the representation of Jesus and his kingdom to the world. Now, I don't want you to get confused. Representation would have fit on there. It's not like it was like making a break. But I wanted to make sure you get that when we are representatives of Jesus Christ, what we do is we represent him.
Amen.
He was presented to us, and we present him to others. How do we do that? We become, because he says we are, the minute we come into his kingdom, we become salt and light. That's really good stuff. You guys should be taking notes. You see, we represent what we've been given to those who do not yet believe, to those who are maybe out on the outskirts and don't always quite say, I get what this whole Jesus thing is about. I don't know about you, but I know that there are always people who hang around a church who haven't quite given their lives completely to Jesus Christ yet. In fact, I have known people who have come through this church who would tell me, actually, the words that I am not yet a believer. I come for this reason, or I come for that reason, and I find it interesting, but I have not yet given my life to Jesus Christ. I don't know if any of you are in that position right now, but if you are, the rest of our job is to represent Christ to you by being the salt and the light of the world.
Amen.
We do this representation as salt. We season, we purify the world, we preserve the kingdom. Jesus kind of told us a little bit about what the kingdom was about when he talked about the Beatitudes. So we live more by the Beatitudes, right? He's going to get into some really heavy stuff in the next few weeks. If you are afraid of getting too close to Christ, don't come. He's going to ask you to do some crazy things. We do it as light because sometimes people will notice us as being different for a godly reason. We're all different. Some of us more than others. But when people can look at you and go, there's something good different. You have something I want. We are being that salt and light. Because what they're starting to realize is they need what we have. See, it's not really doing at all. It's about being.
Amen.
Believe our task. If you want to be one of those people who have a task, I'm going to leave you there this morning. This is your homework, right? Our task is to continuously self-reflect on what we represent. Now here's what I kind of see in that. If you have been a Christ follower for maybe a week, or you've been a Christ follower for 132 years. You represent Christ. Our job, I think, here to be salt and light is to look and say, Jesus, are we doing what you have asked us to do? Hey, help me, Lord, to see myself with eyes that are outside of me. That I would see my actions as though, how am I representing you to the world around me? Am I being a good Christ follower that's representative of what you have come to do, which is to save the world, season the world, purify the world, preserve the world, to be the light in the darkness? Am I able to do that through my actions, through the way I talk, through the way I post on Facebook? Oh, did I say that? Oh. You don't have to worry about Facebook. Just kidding. You see, our representation or our presentation can't be of an institution. And what I have specifically in mind there is the church. So often when we present Christ, what we present is the church. Come to the church. We have a really good church, and we do. It's an awesome church, filled with awesome people.
Amen.
That's right.
Can't be a presentation of an institution. That's not what Jesus came to do. It can't be a presentation of a job description, a to-do list, or more likely when we're talking to non-Christians, it becomes a to-not-do list. I think sometimes the church has done itself the most disservice by presenting all the things that you can't do when you're a Christ follower instead of the things that you can do. And we have to be careful about that. See, if we're not about the salvation of the world through Jesus Christ, we are not being authentic salt and light to the world around us. I'm just going to put it straight out. You can be a good person. You can go and you can say, hey, look, Pastor, I don't know if you noticed or not, but it's Sunday morning, you're up on the platform preaching, and we're here. We got this checked off. No. That's some bad news for you. This is like 25%. Actually coming and worshiping and learning and being discipled and just, kind of getting your fill for sort of the fill up for the week to go out. The other 75% is when you go out and you start discipling others, and when you go out and you start being Christ. Yeah. Representing Him because He lives in you.
Amen.
Anything less, you're not being authentic. If we are salt, are we representing saltiness? And I don't mean the Urban Dictionary. Have you ever poured salt on something at the restaurant? It doesn't do anything. I think of a time or two when that's happened to me. I can think of more times when the lid is loose or something and you go. If we are not presenting saltiness, why not? You see, if you are fundamentally something, that's what people ought to see. Right? So if you are fundamentally a Christ follower, it doesn't matter what else you're doing. What people ought to see is a Christ follower.
Amen.
Not everyone's going to be exactly the same, but are you authentic? I think it's important that we get this. Not everybody's going to look the same. Jesus doesn't say, you are the salt and you are the light and you must all be exactly alike or you're not doing it right. Frankly, our church wouldn't be the same without a couple of troublemakers.
Amen. Yeah.
Wouldn't be the same without some of the talents some people have and some of the talents other people have. And it just wouldn't be the same. But are you authentic with how you're using that gift and how you're using that? Are you an agent of cleansing? Are you an agent of healing? Are you an agent of flavoring in this world? As if you're not, I hate to say this, you might not have things right with God. I know, ouch. But that's why self-reflection is so important. If we're light, are we effective in shining? Light is noticed, right? You can't be a Christ follower and blend into the crowd. We'd like to be. I've told you many a times back in the olden days when I had hair. And I would go and I would get a haircut. Whoever was cutting my hair typically would be chatty, everything. Finally get to that question that they always ask, what do you do? And I would say, oh, I'm the pastor over at Desert Grace or whatever. Be like, oh. Dead silence. Now I would know why they would be blinded by the light. It would be the reflection, but ultimately, for those of you that don't know, I quit getting my hair cut because I kept telling them I didn't need to see the back where the bald spot was, and they kept showing me. And then finally I said, hey, if you're going to keep showing me I have no hair, I'm not going to pay you to cut it. So now I do it myself. If you don't like my haircut, talk to my hairdresser. See, salt and light is not about what we do. It's about being who God has already declared us to be.
Yeah, true.
That sounds easy. I wish it were. I wish it were easier than I think it is. But I want you to remember for a moment the setting of the Sermon on the Mount. I want you to sort of put yourself in the audience. Jesus is a new phenomenon. He's not like some of us who've been following him for a lot of years and who have a lot of Bible school and training and whatever else behind us.
Yep.
Jesus says, all right, blessed are those. And it's the opposite of what we would expect. And then he moves on and you're like, oh good, he's going to get to something we understand. And the first thing out of his mouth is, you are the salt of the earth. When salt loses its saltiness, it's no good anymore. What? This is challenging stuff. I wish that I could tell you that the longer we walk with God, the easier this gets. But one thing that I've noticed about God is that the closer you feel to him, the more he shows you that he can do in your life.
Amen.
You think, okay, good, I'm almost there. I'm about to arrive in Jesus' land and I won't have to do anything else because I'm almost perfect. Well, as good as I'm ever going to get. And Jesus says, oh yeah, watch this. Ching, 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 ching. Oh. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is we get to this passage and we think, I've already got it. I think Jesus wants to tell us, oh, that's funny. It's cute. Self-reflect. Are you really doing what you need to be? I also want to point out that those people were following Jesus because the healings and miracles. Are you only following Jesus because what he's done for you or your best friend? You're going to miss it. You won't be authentic. Would there have been those in the crowd who maybe thought they were followers but actually wouldn't? If we're not careful, oh, that's us. We must be authentic salt and light, or quite frankly, we are not who we say we are. It's just the way it is. I know, it's great news. How bright is your flavor? How bright is it? I don't know if God's been talking to you at all while I've been speaking, or if you've been challenged. I don't normally do altar calls, but the altar is always a good place to talk to him and say, hey, I've got to do some of this self-reflecting. Lord, am I really doing this light and salt thing right? I know it's not about something I'm doing, it's about something I am being. If you feel like you need to get closer to God to be the person he's called you to be, don't leave here this morning till you've done it. Fair enough? Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word, for what you have to say to us. We thank you that you have brought us to this place. We thank you that it's not a to-do list, Lord, but it's a to-be. Help us to be the salt and the light to the world around us. Help us to be the people that you've called us to be. Help us to represent you or represent you well in the world. Help us to absolutely know without a question of a doubt that you are what shines through. Lord, we thank you so much again for the opportunity to be here. Be with us as we leave. Keep us safe until we have the opportunity to worship together once again. In your name we pray. Amen.